protein goal, and the calories is priority number 2. The second example, so across 7 days, it's the same calorie deficit to lose 1.5 pounds a week. But his maintenance calories are the 2 consecutive days. I just put them on Saturday and Sunday because that's typically when people tend to eat more. But they can pick any 2 consecutive days. And then Monday to Friday was dropped a little bit lower so that it's still the same calories in that week. And then you'll notice protein is the exact same still, all days, no matter what their calories are, it just changes carbs and fats. And then just as a general rule for us, we do about 15 grams of fiber per 1,000 calories. And then there's always macronutrient recommendations, which is essentially what's above. We just have this in here for a free version of FitnessPal. You can plug in the percentage instead of because you can't do the numbers exactly. So that is all metabolic stuff that we normally do. Do you have any questions about that so far? Do you want me to go into some of the VO2 stuff? Mm-hmm. Okay. So VO2 test, this person did the combination of both. So then we have the nutrition recommendation and then a training recommendation. So with the active, we call them an active metabolic test, but it's a VO2 max test, we do a spirometry analysis as well. So the spirometry analysis is to look at their lung capacity, because we're looking to find, if we peel back all the layers, of where is the lowest hanging fruit that person could work on. So when it comes to respiratory being related to metabolic function and performance, lung capacity matters before capability. So if they have a capacity limitation, it doesn't matter if they're not using their breath properly because they don't have the capacity. So that's always priority 1. So we do a spirometry analysis to look at that. And that just involves, we just have a little device that Bluetooths to the phone so then the results come up. But we do 3 breaths to get the most data. And it's blowing out into this little mouthpiece as hard as you possibly can. It's actually a very hard test, even though it sounds simple. So you have to blow out as hard and fast as you can to empty your lungs completely within 1 second, but then continue blowing for 6 seconds total. So then we're looking at that expiratory volume, which is that top line, in the first second. And then the second line is across the full 6. And then the third line is looking at the ratio of how much air they were able to push in the first second compared to the full 6. And so typically, it's actually most common to see that the top 2 lines are well into the green and the bottom one not so much. The bottom one, when it gets down to the orange and red, is where you would say, you should probably go see a respiratory therapist, or they might say, well, I have asthma, so ... or COPD, or anything restrictive or obstructive when it comes to lung respiratory function. For general health, anything above, so we always put the numbers, so we have the liters in the bottom, and then the percent of what would be predicted for that person based on their age and height. So if it's above the 100% of predicted from a performance standpoint, that would be what we'd want to see. From a health standpoint, anything above 75% is going to give them the green check mark at the physician, and they're not going to be diagnosed with anything. But when we work with athletes that are focused on it, whether it's endurance training or a sport or anything really from a performance standpoint, we would love to see that it's above that 100% of predicted, because it should be. It should be above 100% of what would be the normal predicted population. And that's just, again, sometimes people's data is like, you're like Iron Man. So we have to find something that could be worked on. So that's sometimes that case. So this one was all good. So no capacity limitation. And then we go into the rest of their cardio data and then look at how their breath frequencies change. Do they hyperventilate, hypoventilate, and how is that affecting oxygen delivery to the muscles? We put sensors on the leg that actually measures then oxygen consumption at the muscle or utilization. So it's really looking at oxygen from intake, delivery, and then uptake through all 3 levels, which is why doing all the tests together is what makes it the most beneficial program. They get a VO2 max score, which everybody probably listens to all the podcasts on that, but essentially it's your cardiovascular fitness gold star metric, as well as longevity. It's huge in the longevity. One of the top things you can look at in terms of, if I was to get a bunch of numbers for how good my longevity is, that would be one of the main ones. So the way we look at that is actually we measure their oxygen throughout their entire VO2 test, which involves a 3-minute warm-up. 9 to 12 minutes running, biking, air9, whatever it might be. And then a 2.5 minute recovery, still with the mask on, and then the device is in a backpack and you just tighten it on. So same device as what you saw in Pauline, same mask. And then we just tape the sensor on the largest part of their quad, muscle belly there. So then throughout the test, we put them through the warm-up. We always do a parameter check before that so that we know what their warm-up speed should be based on heart rate. And then we try to personalize the test because from the 9 to 12 minute mark, the speed, if you're on a treadmill, increases by a certain increment every minute until you get that person to their max. So the parameter check is there to make sure that that increment is personalized to them so that you get them from 0 to 100 within 9 minutes. So the parameter check has to be good so that they last 9 minutes, but they can't go more than 12 to get a true VO2 max score. So then throughout that test, we find where their oxygen volume peaks. Whatever that measure is in milliliters is just divided by their weight in kilograms, unless you go liters to grams or whatever. And that's when you get a number. And then we just rank it based on age and gender as to where they fit in terms of a percentile. So then, when we know what their heart rate zones are, zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, zone 3 is where they would want to train, and then graduating into zone 4, but to improve that VO2 max score. And if that was a limitation, so obviously for this person, the yellow and fair is not a great score, so zone 3 is definitely part of the training recommendation for that person until we start to see that change. Then we have a whole chart with their heart rate zones, so you can see them in the colors, and then we just look at, is that zone within the optimal percentage of their max heart rate based on their test. And then we go below that in case people don't have a heart rate monitor. They know what speed and incline that was at for training purposes. And then this is the part where we look at calories from exercise. So you can see the 10 calories per minute in zone 1, 13.5 in 2, all the way up to 22 by that last zone. So when it comes to weight loss, you wouldn't typically worry too much about it. When it comes to performance and someone is training like an endurance athlete and they're out for 2-3 hour runs, you want to look at the average calories they burn within whatever heart rate zone they're running in, so you know that refueling gauge. When I do some of these tests with people prior to a race, for example, like triathlon, I can just look at carbohydrates that are utilized during whatever they're going to race at in terms of heart rate, and then they can refuel those carbs on the bike, prior to the race, on the bike, after the race, to optimize that recovery and, for lack of a better term, basically prevent them from bonking during their race. And then the bottom is looking at breath frequency. So that's where you start to see if they have no capacity limitation, do they have a capability limitation with breathing, so how they're moving oxygen and CO2. So the oxygen, all the way throughout the test until you get into anaerobic, you'll see that oxygen levels are higher than CO2. There's always a switch where that's when someone goes into, or out of zone 4. So that's that top of that zone 4, whereas the top of someone's zone 2 isn't math. It's not technically where they have an RPE of I can still talk while I'm running type of thing. Although that typically tends to be pretty close because it is correlated with someone's fitness ability. It is where the body changes gears into utilizing more carbohydrates than fats, whereas you utilize more fats in zone 1 and 2. So wherever that switch occurs is where zone 2 then ends, and then you're in zone 3. And then whenever O2 and CO2 flip, that's when you know you're out of zone 4 and into zone 5. Good grief. So that's kind of part of all the metrics that go into the heart rate zones themselves and making them based on someone's physiology versus 220 minus your age and then what's 85% of that, for example, because it changes with fitness level. And then what's cool when you track it is that you know what someone's zone 2 might be, you have them train in that zone, and then they come back and retest, and they're either, that heart rate zone has increased by a lot, or their speed within that zone has increased. Because ideally, if you could run an entire marathon in zone 2 and actually go fast, that would be amazing, because utilizing more fat for fuel is an indication that your cells have better mitochondrial density, better capillarization, and you're delivering oxygen to the body better. So then that leads into, after analyzing all that, so if this is a weight loss report, so in an endurance athlete's report, there'd be more of the data from the muscle oxygen sensor, and a little bit more respiratory stuff. But then we put in their training recommendations. So for this person in particular, zone 2 and 3 for that VO2 max, 2 for increasing their fat burning utilization. Fat utilization is why those recommendations are there. And I also knew his goals, and I also know where he's at in terms of what he can do, because to improve that fat and carb fuel source bar from the resting test really requires zone 2 and zone 5. This guy's not going to do zone 5, so we're going to go for the VO2 max stuff first, build the base, and then you can work on the other stuff later. So lots of different things that come into consideration, and then we always give a training week example based on what they put in their intake, but we also have an area here for the person to also fill out with their trainer based on what else they're currently doing, especially when they're part of a gym and you don't want to give their trainer this and say, okay, this is all the running they have to do, but they also have a full strength plan. So it's kind of for you to fill both in. And then there are some guidelines here just in terms of the recovery between, so 48 hours between some of the higher intensity intervals versus zone 2 you could do on the same day as a strength workout. Just try to split them and do the zone 2 or the long, slow, intense cardio later in the day, especially if that person's goal is still strength based. Because the zone 2 stuff will still generate that fatigue. I think the biggest thing, other than just giving them their recommendations, is explaining to them how to do the interval training. So even though zone 5, so you can kind of see what they are here. Even though zone 5, which is that top bar on the right chart, is 8 to 10 sets of 10 to 30 seconds, doesn't mean it's a 30-second sprint. It means that you run until your heart rate's in your zone 5, and then that 30-second timer starts. So it's still an hour of training pretty much, especially for someone super fit. And then you get into a limitation of the fact that your legs can't run at speed 11 on the treadmill and your heart rate's like still below zone 5 and your legs peter out. So then you know that's where more of a strength limitation comes in versus cardiovascular. So there's always whatever that person's lowest hanging fruit is that you can build on, and then the retesting just sees, okay, what worked, what's next. And then from the metabolic standpoint, same thing. They're tracking their nutrition, hopefully, not everybody does, but they track it over time, and then they see the changes in their body composition, but then you recheck their metabolism, because if someone's losing weight, eventually, or else they would lose weight forever, their metabolism will adjust to that new energy balance of in versus out. And that's why people's metabolism sometimes comes up as very slow, is because they've yo-yo dieted so much. They might, and it might just be because they're super fit and they have a very low body fat percentage, and they're neat, and the level of activity they do is so high, so their body has learned how to not require that much to do nothing. That makes sense. I find a lot of people, they look at it and they're like, oh my god, I thought my metabolism was so slow, I can't lose weight. And it's like, you actually eat a lot more than you think you do. And that's why and you don't burn as much as you think you do. And that's why your metabolism is actually fast. Fast is maybe not even the right word, because again, it's just a number, and fast is ranking you based on how tall you are, and your gender, and your weight, and your age. So to me, the percentage really doesn't matter. It just matters, the ranking of fast or slow doesn't really matter. It just matters that you use the number and then adjust accordingly. So obviously, the higher that number, the better, because you can eat more, essentially. Without having to reduce calories and nutrition and stuff like that. So I think the only other real conversation changer is that someone might come with, I need to lose weight and it has to be 30 pounds. That's the only thing I care about. And then you do find out they have a slow metabolism, because that's the worst. Because then you're like, you will literally not lose weight unless you eat 800 calories. So we need to build your metabolism first. But it's cool to have the numbers and the data to show that. So then that person's like, okay, well, let's build it, and then we'll measure when it's ready, when I'm ready to lose weight. So that's sometimes a harder conversation, but yeah, everyone's different, so it's cool. Any questions?
Just curious if the whole zone 2 thing, comes up with Stacey Sims and postmenopause women shouldn't train in zone 2, it's not good for them type of thing. So the data that this is based on, does that factor in kind of current research or contemporary research on perimenopausal, menopausal, postmenopausal women and how training affects them or their needs?
Yeah, so funny, I was just listening to that recently, and I think what she's talking about, Stacey, to be exact, is she's talking about the level of fatigue and muscle breakdown that zone 2 would technically cause, which impedes with building muscle, which is the whole point of what she's talking about.
Right.
So it's just separate, and both are important, but yes, for different reasons. So zone 2 is important if someone's not good at utilizing fat for fuel, because if they're not, then they're probably, those are the people that are typically gonna end up being overweight.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, both are important. Like if someone wasn't doing zone 2, but they had good, like their zone 2 was in the optimal spot, then they won't need to do it. I mean, maintaining it's a good idea, but it wouldn't be part of that recommendation.
Right.
But yeah.
But she did make a quite harsh blanket statement and about a couple things that I
Yeah.
think, you know, like F45 and stuff like that.
Yeah,
she
yeah.
really ticked off some orange
Oh,
theory
for
people
sure.
and stuff. But
Yeah.
but I think her point is that women need to be building muscle and lifting heavier.
Yeah, and she's
And
talking about
her-
central nervous system too, which is like zone 5.
Right.
So like zone 5 would be in favor of what? Because she was talking about doing those sprints, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's definitely in favor of what she was saying.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of when you look at this stuff, what's your low-hanging fruit? And then how do I build my base so that everything I do from a performance standpoint and a health standpoint is the baseline of that threshold is just higher.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I'm just curious still if the way they built testing, because one of her big points is a lot of the data out there is based on testing on men. So I'm wondering if the data to build the programs is based on who it's based on.
Yeah, that's why we do the parameter check.
Right.
I don't know if you walked in after that or before that.
Yeah.
But basically we put the person on the treadmill, for example, and then we get their heart rate between 100 and 110.
Right.
And then that's going to be an increment above their warm-up speed. And then we go from there. So then basically it's kind of perceived exertion after that. So then we ask them, okay, what's your level 6 out of 10 speed-wise that you could do for 5 minutes? And then I put that number in, and then I do what's your 9 out of 10. Basically, what's your 2-minute sprint? Put that in, and then the increments come up. So then I just put the increments into the device from the back end. Another thing I said was a lot of the research is based on metabolic testing that only measures oxygen, not CO2 as well. So there's only a couple devices that do both, which changes things too, of course. But science has new stuff coming out all the time. So, yeah.
But it's a way for clients to be able to actually see where
Measure and
they
see.
are at versus just taking a recommendation from Stacey Sims
Yeah.
and saying, this is what you should be doing.
Right, because they don't know
You
what
actually
the parameters are.
where you're at, right?
Can we back up a second? Who are we talking about? Who's
So
coming?
Stacey Sims. You don't know.
You don't know Stacey
Your wife. You don't know Stacey Sims.
She wrote the book Roar.
Yeah. It's all.
Oh, my
No.
She's an
Take
exercise
letters.
physiologist, exercise something or
Is she
other.
MD?
She is an exercise.
No.
Anyway, high exercise, knowledgeable background, from the States, in New Zealand, basically writing about women going through perimenopause and how, what their needs are, specific to women's hormonal changes as hormones fluctuate and then go.
And am I understanding that her number 1 is strength training? Is that what you were basically
Her
saying?
number one for
And
women's
not to
strength.
do too much
No,
zone
not
2
to
because
not.
then that's going to
So she
impede
tried
the
not to
cardio,
not
keep
right?
going.
Yeah, she kind of talks of in it in the sense of
Blanket statement.
not even doing hypertrophy training, but strength training. So it's the central nervous system activation.
Sure.
Because their hormones, testosterone and stuff is deregulated, they don't build muscle and they don't keep it on as effectively. So the central nervous system trigger of the sprints and heavy lifts, but less reps, is what she kind of wants. She's like, they shouldn't do it.
Substitutes for the
They
hormones.
shouldn't do, unless it's real hit, which is kind of like the intervals I was talking about. Like, you get to that max and then you, like your real max, and then you recover properly. And then, because in between you have to come to that zone 1, you stay in your zone 1, that actually improves your recovery. Versus just stopping for 20 seconds and really just getting to zone 4, and then going back to zone 5. But yeah, that's kind of what she,
Interesting.
for menopausal women.
We could have a whole other lunch.
Yeah.
It's a certain quantity of cardio
lot of money.
Yeah.
Right?
Most of an hour.
You got to see more about your like pelvis, all
Yeah,
sorts
I
of
mean,
anatomy, you got the whole thing.
Screen stimulus and what.
How do you navigate?
Yeah, that's
the
right.
population that's comorbidity? Like obviously, there's a huge percentage of people that look to get this kind of testing done.
Yeah.
So they are active,
Again,
which
yeah,
I would say.
exactly.
They're asking this question, that's a little bit of understanding, not a good understanding, but a bit of understanding of what they're eating, what they're doing, but let's say like our general public, like I'm seeing, are riddled with tons of other things, so how does that fit into how?
In terms of being able to do the test,
Or just like, yeah, maybe a vision.
there's a walk-in version, a walking in kind version.
Yeah, and just like systemic,
And that's
like,
my point,
I
that's
don't,
my
it's hard for me to come up with one person that's walked through the doors that doesn't have other shit going on in their
Yeah, yeah.
body. So how do we pair those things together when we're gonna have limitations? How does that work with the numbers? Like, you might not have the answer, but.
Yeah, I think it would depend on the person, like, if you like, from the metabolic testing standpoint, I would say 90% of people have injuries from being overweight and not being strong enough to support their body weight, and losing weight would be effective in
Yeah.
itself.
So how, like,
But it depends on the person.
like maybe an inflammatory issue, like someone that has ulcerative colitis or Crohn's or something where it then becomes complicated, like.
Yep,
What
that's
do we
like
do?
that's the conversation that I spoke about, how it's 3 different conversations: quality, quantity, psychological
Yeah.
conversation. Which I always want to delineate, because everybody out there is like, calories don't matter, and then the next person is like, go vegetarian, and then the next person is like, eat till you're full. It's like, but you don't have that. Like, those hormones don't work.
Yeah.
So it has to depend on the person. It's just got to be like different conversations, and then it really depends on the person. And because it's not as easy, like it's not something you just like Google and they're like, oh, to your chiropractor, for example. Like, everybody knows what that is. It's hard to Google. Well, fair.
Yeah, I actually hope they don't know what chiropractor is. It's actually way better for if they don't know chiropractor, then you come in.
I think we've lost the plot.
Yeah, to answer your question, it really, really depends on the person.
Yeah.
But there's always a benefit to knowing it as a baseline, because if they improve on other health metrics, you see if those things improve or if they're not a factor involved.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, in that sense too, I would even say if someone thinks they're like the epitome of health, it's still good to have baseline once a year, so that you know if something seriously changes too. But
Yeah,
again,
I
that's
think you could pull
just,
in like other specialists too, like if you have.
Oh,
a
for
patient
sure.
And then
actually that
you
leads
talk
me
to
to
like
what
a
I'm supposed to talk about.
respirologist or a cardiologist or something, you work
Totally.
together, figure out how do we meet these goals given the fact that they have ABC going on.
Yeah, which is where we look at a lot of this data, and some people are like, well, why do I do that test if nothing's wrong with me? It's like, because we can rule it out. But if I couldn't rule it out, I might have to send you to respiratory therapist, cardiologist, whatever. In some senses. But that's what I was going to say too. We were just going to talk about how to incorporate what we're doing with the lab stuff and other trainers or healthcare practitioners, etc. Is that like co-referral system of, like, a lot of times I'll do different testing with people and their mobility is terrible, and it's like, I can't even give you a recommendation until you fix that ankle moving and that one not moving, for example, because your whole, like, that's gotta be step one. Nutrition, same thing. People don't, and like there's 90% of people are not able to do it without the help of someone else. There's like the 10%, maybe even the 1% that you can give numbers to, and they're, like Sarah, diligent, will just do it on their own. But no one really does that, typically. So that accountability piece from anybody is important, but then obviously when you have like someone like Jess who is trained in that stuff, you can have those more informed conversations with that person and bring in the quality piece as well. But what we have, so we can do the resting tests with the body composition, and we can do the active test with the spirometry, or you can put them together into the what we would call a full bioburn package. But we have started doing a 12-week package with that stuff that splits the testing up a bit, and they get a couple retests. So then they're seeing the change from the data standpoint as well. And then because everyone's metabolism adjusts at a different rate or speed, so we can see when that changes and adjust accordingly. So what would be beneficial, because we're just a lab, we really just want to be a lab, but we know how important the accountability and the training and the coaching and the counseling and all that stuff is in between. So having the partnerships where they might do a 12-week package with us and a 12-week package with a personal trainer. And so then there's all these touch points and data and training that are all like working in synergy with each other, or it might be training and nutrition. And so there's a nutrition, training, and chiro and testing combined into one big package of 12 weeks that like gets every part of the system, and then it's like, hey, then that last week, here's your ongoing plan.
Yeah, cost on this.
So for just the testing for 12 weeks is $7.99. So less than $100 a week. If you just did the resting, so we're doing it October 3rd and 4th next week, and it's $149 for the resting test and the composition and the report review with the nutrition recommendation. $199 for the active test with the spirometry, and then the training recommendation, and we go over the report. So when you combine them, it's $350.
The active test, the VO2.
Yeah.
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 And there's a chunk of that that's
It's chiro.
chiro because it's.
Yeah, so it's like chiro assigned testing, like the chiro assigned training, just because the owners are chiropractors.
And they're the ones that analyze all the data, right? Like that, so that part that they're involved in is covered under extended health for people. Not the actual active part that Briana is doing, but the other portion of it, which is beneficial for people that want to have it. So that $7.99, a portion of that would be.
Yeah, it just gets broken up into their appointment time, like
Right.
appointment times based on whatever tests they would be doing.
Cool, thank you.